We have looked at sequence, we've looked at selection and if statements. Now we're going to look at repetition and loops. So I'm going to go to JavaScript samples, and I'm going to look at the last three here, and then we'll move on to the next group. Okay, so the first one is while loop 5. And all of these are doing the same thing. They're just illustrating the structure of a particular loop. So here I'm saying, how many times should I write the line? And let's say I pick 5. And I say OK, and it writes the line 5 times. So now if I look at the view source, you can see the structure of the while loop. First of all, I have a variable called data input. And I prompted, and you or I, the user, responded and said 5. So data input has become 5. Then I set up a variable called count. Now, usually I set up all my variables at the beginning, but I wanted to make a point here. And so I set the variable count equal to 1 right before I entered the loop, so that the count equals 1, and then I enter the loop. Inside the loop, I have a while, and a while is one way of doing a loop in JavaScript. And then I have the condition inside parentheses. So while this condition is true, I will do the loop. The data in the loop that I'm doing is enclosed in curly braces. So while count is less than or equal to data input, I will continually do those two statements, document write and count equals count plus 1. So how does this work? I set count to 1. And I said, while count is less than or equal to data input, 1 is less than or equal to 5, so I go into the loop. And I do a document write, and I write out this is number, concatenated with the content of count, which is now 1, concatenated with the BR, which moves me down to the next line. And then I add 1 to count. So count is now a 2. And then I go back and I say, while count is less than or equal to data input. Well, 2 is less than or equal to 5. So I go in, I do a document write and write out this is number 2. Then I add 1 to count, making count now a 3. And I loop back, and 3 is less than or equal to 5. So I go in and I write out this is number 3. And I add 1 to count, which brings it up to a 4. And then I go back and I say, okay, 4 is less than or equal to data input. So I write out this is number 4. And again, the BR moves me down to the next line. And then I add 1 to count, and it's now a 5. I go back and I say, while count is less than or equal to data input, okay, and 5 is less than or equal to, so it writes out this is number 5. And then I add 1, and count now becomes 6. So when it goes back, while count is less than or equal to data input, count is 6, data input is 5, so count is not less than or equal to data input. So I do not enter the loop again. I drop out to the line after the loop, because remember, the curly braces surround the things in the loop that are being executed. I drop out, I do a document write, and I write BR plus this is the end. Now notice here I did a literal BR in quotes, plus a literal this is the end in quotes, and I concatenated them together, and that worked fine. But I could have just had one set of quotes. I sort of said, quote, the BR tag, and then written, this is the end, explanation, 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 all in one literal. And that would have worked equally well and probably a little easier. Now, a loop has 3 things, okay? So for a loop, to work successfully, I need to have, first, I need to set the control. And this time I decided that count was going to be my control because I am doing it until count is less than or equal to data input. So count is my control. So I set the control, which in this case is count. Then I check the control. And I do that in the condition on the loop. Okay, so in the condition for the loop, I check the control. Is count less than or equal to data input? And the third thing I have to do is change the control. So I add 1 to count, and count equals count plus 1 is I am increasing count by 1. So sooner or later, count is going to be greater than data input. Okay, and then I'm going to get out. Now, if I forgot to do that, and I did that one time early in my programming career, I was working in a company with a big mainframe and a big printer, and the guy from the print area came out and handed me a pile of paper, probably 2 or 3 inches thick. And every single page said exactly the same thing. And he said, "Did you really want to print this 1,000 or so times?" And I very embarrassingly admitted that no, I did not want to do that. And the problem was that I hadn't changed the control. I had a count, and I had not changed the control. And so it just kept doing it over and over and over again. And there were some other things that I had done wrong too, but one of the things was I never changed the control. Okay. So now I'm going to look at the structure, 2 other structures that work with JavaScript loops. So the next one is the do loop. And so again, I'm going to say 5. I'm putting in 5. And then enter, and I get it 5 times. So this has in it view page source. This has a slightly different looping situation. This has a do loop. The last one we looked at was a while loop. This is a do, and actually it's a do while. The big thing to notice here is that in this particular loop, there is no test at the beginning, which means that I just hit the do, and I then go inside the loop. And I do the document write. This is number 1. I add 1 to count. And then I go down and I check to see if I should do the loop again. So the while here is checking to see if I should go back and do it again. Well, I've added 1 to count, and count is now a 2. And so is 2 less than or equal to 5? Yes, it is. So I go back and do the loop again. So I go back to the do. I document write. This is number 2. I add 1 to count, which is now a 3. And I check, is count less than or equal to data input? 3 is less than or equal to 5, so I go back. I hit the do. I drop in. I do a document write, and I write out, this is number 3. I add 1 to count, and I check. 4 is less than data input, so I go back. I document write, this is number 4. I add 1 to count, and I'm up to 5. I say, well, 5 is less than or equal to 5. It is, so I go back to the do. I do the loop again. I write out, this is number 5. I add 1 to count, which makes it 6. And then when I check, count is no longer less than or equal to data input, which is 5. 6 is not less than or equal to 5. So I document right. This is the end. I do not go back to the do. I do not redo the loop. Then the next one, and the last one of these threes that I'm looking at, is the for loop. So again, I'm going to put in 5, and my mouse again, when I move it to go and put in the 5, it was reacting strongly. So there's the 5, and there's my 5 times. So now I'm going to look at this source. Okay. So again, I'm seeing the same result that I saw other times. This is a for loop. And the interesting part of a for loop, and I'm waiting here a minute, that everything is done inside the for loop. So if I look at this, I've got the 3 things I need to do for a loop. I need to set the control, and I do that inside the for by saying count equals 1. Then I need to check the control, and I do that inside the for when I say count is less than or equal to data input. And I need to change the control, which I do when I say count equals count plus 1. So all 3 of the things, the set the control, check the control, change the control, are all inside the for statement. So the only thing I need to have that I need to execute is the document right. So I start out and I set up variable count equals 1, but I really didn't have to do that because I'm setting count equal 1 inside the for loop. But when I defined the variable, I just went ahead and did that. I didn't have to. So I'm saying for count equal 1, and then I put a semicolon. That takes care of the set control. Now I put in what I want to check, and I want to check is count less than or equal to data input. And then lastly, I want to put in what I want to change, and I want to add 1 to count. And so it goes through the loop, and each time when it goes back, it increments count by 1. Okay, it knows that the count equals 1 is only when you enter the first time from a drop down. You drop down to it from an instruction above, and that's the time it says count equal to 1. It always checks, and after the first time, it always adds 1 to count or does the change. So those are 3 ways that you can do loops within JavaScript. We looked at the while, we looked at the do while, and we looked at the for.